Welcome! In this video, I'm going to analyse the difference between static maps like the ones used in Left 4 Dead and Warhammer Darktide versus the procedurally generated ones used in Deep Rock Galactic. These games want us to keep coming back and playing the same missions over and over again. So how do developers keep us engaged? Are static maps heading for the scrap heap? And is there a better way to go forward? During my research for this video, I discovered 3 fantastic podcasts: the Level Design Lobby, Game Dev Unchained, and the Friends Per Second podcast. If you want to understand the industry more, they are such a great place to start. More info in the description, and now let's get into it. So what exactly are static maps? Well, as the name suggests, these maps don't change between different playthroughs or runs of them. They have a static layout every time you play it. Static maps are sometimes referred to as traditional maps, and we can think of Left 4 Dead as our perfect example of static maps. Static maps are still being used in modern horde shooters, such as Back 4 Blood and Warhammer Darktide. It's Darktide that we're going to focus on in this video, as I've recently put over 300 hours into it. So, how are static maps actually created? Well, the developer might have used some kind of procedural or random generation to assist in the creation of the level, using that as a starting point to then be adapted manually. In this showcase for Unreal Engine, we can see this concept being played around with. And with greater AI tools in development, this kind of starting point may well become the standard in the not too distant future. Currently though, it's far more likely that the developer, or to be more specific, the level design team, in conjunction with other departments such as environmental art, concept art, sound design and so on, would have created pretty much everything from scratch. Level designers generally start with a paper and planning phase. This is to get the idea of how the level will work in principle. They also then have a mock-up to show senior designers and project leads for approval or advice. With sign-off of a paper concept, the level designer can create a map in 2D or potentially the engine itself. They will often start with very basic placeholder objects as they develop and iterate the general shape of the level. When the layout is pretty much set in stone, they can then warrant spending more time on making the objects and the environment look better, bringing other departments in like art and sound. The map will go through many iterations, likely hundreds if not thousands. Plenty of back and forth between managers, art designers and so on. And sometimes the art team itself can actually influence the layout of the map, with then further iterations required to resolve a potential issue or take full benefit of a beautifully designed bit of environmental art. And of course, playtesters then need to test the level itself with further iterations based on their feedback. And this is all before we gamers get even close to the finished map to then only provide our additional feedback for then more iterations when the game is live. To go through the entire creation process for a static map from design to completion, I can only imagine is a mammoth undertaking, especially depending on the size and complexities of the game and map in question. With all of the steps in this design process, static maps have a huge level of control. And control is a theme we're going to be coming back to. This design process should hopefully create a map that fits the style, feel and tone of the game, whilst also including game mechanics and design fundamentals laid out by the game director for the project. So how does procedural generation work? Well, it's quite different to the process we've just gone through and comes in different forms that we need to understand. One is random generation. This is where the developer will create a lot of different assets that will then be reused multiple times in this random generation process. You may have played or heard of games that use tile sets. Diablo 2 and 3 use this method. The designer creates lots of individual tiles, hundreds if not thousands depending on the size of the game. They also create assets such as chests, armor racks and so on. The random generation then mixes up the order and placement of the tiles to form a map that is different each time. This is random generation. Deep Rock Galactic uses procedural generation. Rather than a level design team and the other departments creating maps from scratch, instead we have a mathematic formula that generates a map randomly using variable set parameters. The developer still needs to create art assets for the formula to adjust and work with. Environmental art creating terrain that can be manipulated and still function. Concept art will need to design and create the look of items, with sound design getting involved and level designers making sure it all functions in-game. The procedural generator works with all of these assets, creating the map with different layouts, the environmental art used in different ways, and the placement of art assets or objectives randomly to create a unique experience for the player. It takes a long time in Deep Rock Galactic, or DRG if I'm going to call it going forward, before you get the feeling of doing the exact same map twice. And even then, it's not the exact same map, it's just that feeling that you've seen elements of it before. So how does procedural generation impact game mechanics? And of course there is a trade-off. The more you push the variables, the greater chance you have of a unique map, but you also risk breaking that map and it not working at all. DRG has more freedom with its procedural generation. It can increase those random variables, providing a greater chance of making maps feel unique and doing it more often. It can do this because it has game mechanics that provide a generous amount of player choice to manipulate terrain and traverse in a myriad of interesting, fun, and quite frankly hilarious ways. Bad procedural generation can actually help with the core gameplay loop of DRG. It forces players to use terrain manipulation and those traversal tools to navigate these situations. This turns a potential problem into improved gameplay experience in most situations for the player. Procedural generation requires a developer to create a tool that can adjust the game assets and create maps that don't just technically work, but are actually fun to play. I would think this is quite an undertaking requiring technical expertise to design and code. A lot of time and resources would presumably be allocated to create this tool, iterate on it, and test the results. And just like our static design process, I am sure there are so many iterations and back and forths that need to happen to ensure this procedural generation works. Playtesting must be potentially a longer process, as many seeds or map generations need to be tested to confirm that it's got a high percentage of consistency. So how do they stack up compared to each other? Procedurally generated maps trade that level of control and design freedom for continued variation over a longer period of time, potentially making a map have fewer interesting things to do, but they have a certain level of uniqueness each time they are played. Static maps have that control. The developer can make them more complicated. They can have scripted set pieces and events that can be interesting and really engaging. But they lose that variation, potentially making even the best written and scripted event feel very repetitive after many plays. Depending on how complicated your game and the mechanics you have in it are, it's going to determine if procedural generation is even possible. But also how often that procedural generation will be a success. And this is not just if the map technically functions, but also if it will be fun for the player each time. We know DRG can increase those random variables in its maps because it can fall back on terrain manipulation and those traversal tools to resolve bad procedural generation. Games like Darktide that don't have those mechanics must ensure all paths and interaction points can be accessed every single time. It only takes one issue and the map may not be able to be completed. If it used procedural generation, they would need to really dial down those algorithms, ensuring that the map functions 100% of the time. But dialing back the algorithm and reducing those random elements will start to make the map feel more generic, and it defeats the whole purpose of using procedural generation anyway. And this is where we are left with this delicate balance. Can the variables be increased to the point where the game still works, yet the map feels unique and fun every time it's played? And if we can't achieve that, we need to use static maps that can be designed and controlled to ensure they function every time they are played. Whether a map is procedural or static, the developer will still need to ensure that the player's engagement is high and they don't get bored too quickly. So we need to understand that we get bored incredibly quickly. Humans have evolved to be constantly looking for change, and as gamers, if we don't see that change, it can start to feel mundane. Games generally have one core gameplay loop or multiple smaller ones put together. This is effectively like us running on a treadmill, doing the same thing. If the core gameplay loop is compelling enough, it blinds us to the fact that we're on that treadmill doing the same thing. And in addition, game makers will often put a carrot on a stick for us to chase. That's normally some form of progression, whether it's levels, new abilities, better equipment, or cosmetics, for example. And finally, in this really narrow and focused analogy, we have the scenery, the map or the world we are playing in. And that scenery can have a huge impact on our engagement with a game. If maps are created poorly, either visually, limited variability, or lacking in player engagement, it can start to detract from that gameplay loop, and even those progression mechanics can start to feel stale. As a player, we might start to realise we are on that treadmill if the scenery or those maps are staying the same each time. We can start to think about jumping off of the treadmill, effectively stopping to play that game. And this is something the developer will want to delay as long as possible. Especially if the game has the dreaded live service title attached to it, some kind of in-game season pass whether it's paid or not, or a cash store just like Darktide has. So tactics are used to keep us engaged, and these tactics are used in static map games and procedurally generated ones. Hordes of enemies will spawn at random intervals and with variable strength. With DRG, this keeps the players on their toes as they navigate a unique procedurally generated map. Whilst Darktide aims to make each player of the map feel different, potentially having memorable fights at different locations across the same map. Both games also use a variety of different enemy types. These different enemies may spawn at random times, and they might spawn in abundance or not at all on certain maps. This helps mix up that gameplay feel, even if it is a static map or procedurally generated one. Map modifiers and secondary objectives are also used by both games to varying degrees of success. This is another layer of adding variability. This helps to reduce the chance of the game feeling stale or prolong the feeling of a fresh experience. DRG also takes us to the next step with an additional layer of random elements. There is a percentage chance for unique creatures, machine events, crates and so on. These elements can act not only as progression incentives, but also provide variability in the gameplay. You never know what you can quite expect in any given map. And of course we have more traditional tactics and factors. What class you use or character, the weapons or different loadouts, and other human players who will add variability to our runs. All the tactics we've looked at so far work for both procedurally generated and static maps, but this next one is really just in the realm of static maps, and that is the fact that you can have tons of maps. Now I have not played Back 4 Blood, but it launched with 33 maps compared to the handful that Darktide had at launch. Most people agree the Back 4 Blood campaign is longer than Left 4 Dead, yet we can see these negative comments. People saying the maps feel boring, but also they lament the fact that there aren't custom maps to increase the quantity that they can play. So we need to look at some of the major issues when it comes to static maps. The design process is a lengthy one, and you have to do this for every single map in your game. And it must take even longer to try and get all of those special elements together to make it memorable and fun. And if the developer needs to spam out as many static maps as possible to keep us players engaged, that quality can start to drop. Especially if we factor in crunch. A level designer working a 70-hour week for weeks or months on end is probably going to be going to a dry well for inspiration when it comes to map design. Earlier on we looked at the fact that if procedural generation becomes so mundane it defeats the purpose of having it, the same goes for our static maps. If they are all really generic, it does not matter if you have 5, 30 or 100, the player will get fed up with them super quickly. Having tons of maps in our games also can cause another issue, and that is that players may never feel like they get to know any of the maps in particular. If it takes a long time to cycle back to the same map, you never get to that familiar place with it. As humans, we are often searching for that familiar feeling. Familiar feels comfortable to our brains. But paradoxically, we are also constantly looking for change. When something gets too familiar, it gets mundane and boring. This is really difficult to manage as a game designer because there's such a narrow sweet spot to reach for. This is where the player has an idea of the map going into it, but still wants to try different routes, different tactics, and to do better this time round. The goal is to then keep that player in the sweet spot for as long as possible, using the tactics we spoke about in the previous section. For the modern gamer, we have far greater expectations going forward than perhaps any time in the past. We are expecting new twists on the old formula and new technologies to push innovation. The issues with static maps are big ones, lots of time to create them, only for the player to potentially get bored of them really quickly. And the current tactics developers use to prolong our enjoyment of them might have felt fresh 5 to 10 years ago, but these tactics are just not good enough in modern gaming. In Darktide, fighting the Horde in this doorway compared to this doorway the previous time doesn't make the map feel less repetitive. And this is a problem for many of our modern games, the developers potentially wanting us to engage for years and invest not just our precious hours, but also cash into things like season passes, downloadable content, and cosmetics. Yet we know static maps by their nature are counterintuitive to long-term player engagement, with the same going for mundane procedural generation. And we know that a lot of games, Darktide included, static maps was the logical answer based on the mechanics and requirements of the game. But as the player, we can really feel our engagement being stretched over many plays of the same static maps. And that sweet spot where we're familiar yet still looking forward to the map is fleetingly small. And when we get to 40 plus plays of the same maps, just like I've done in Darktide, the likelihood to disengage is really high. I personally think the static maps like we have in Left 4 Dead and now in Darktide are not fit for purpose in modern gaming. I don't think the static map is dead, but I think the truly static map should be relegated to the past. So what do I mean by truly static map? We're going to briefly examine one of the more mundane maps in Darktide so we can really understand what a static map is. After a brief walk and some small fights, we come to this large open area which is normally a huge battle. There are very short paths left and right where you can get to the other side of this combat arena. And we can see just how short these paths are with this live video completely not sped up. This takes us to a small combat arena, again with a super short path on the left, or we can go straight down the middle. This opens up into a bit more of an interesting walkway fight where we can go left, right, or down the middle. We go through a tiny combat area to then get to this stairwell. We then have this area with two paths which lead us to a hole which takes us to the next section. From this hole we can go straight forward into another combat area, or, as you've probably guessed, there's another alternate route we can take on the left hand side. This combat area is actually quite interesting. You've got elevation, you've got different paths and different routes you can take. There is a scripted set piece fight on this bridge. This light comes on whilst you wait for the elevator and you take on the hordes. At the bottom of the elevator we've got a different combat arena, and then you guessed it, two different paths to get to the next section, or technically there's an additional third path, but it's just a tiny corridor. We then go in a straight line up to this courtyard area. There is a dead end to one side with some pickups, but basically we're going the other way. From here we go through these doors where we've basically got a straight path ahead with an alternate route on the left hand side, and then we've got almost an identical looking room for another set of doors with an alternate path on the right hand side instead of the left hand side. This small combat arena through this door leads us to another small combat arena, and then we are in a straight line to the end of the map where we then have our final objective. You have to destroy 3 of these infected consoles, one after the other. I think they randomly spawn at different locations to mix it up a little bit. You then wait by this fence, and then when the fence opens, that's the end of the map. And when we look at this crude overlay that I've made up, we can see just how basic and linear this map is, and nothing is going to change each time you play it other than the random spawns. Maybe you're going to be using a different class. It's basically going to stay the same every time you play this map. When I think of a truly static map, it is a map like this that we have in a modern era game such as Darktide. I just don't think this is good enough in modern gaming, especially a game which wants us to engage over many years and keep playing these same maps over and over again. Truly static maps will always start to feel stale no matter how good the gameplay loop is. We need a new approach, one that is going to make it so players stay in that sweet spot for far longer and want to return to these maps that they feel familiar with yet enjoy playing. Instead, we need new tactics to make our static maps feel dynamic. In writing, there is a world building term where your settings should be like an iceberg. The reader or the viewer can only see the visible top bit, but they feel like there is so much more under the water that's going on, and that makes the world feel alive. A truly static map is understood so quickly, you know the start, middle and ending after perhaps just 5 to 10 plays. Even with random enemy spawns, different special enemies, classes, etc., you can see the whole iceberg. You know there is nothing under the water that's going to surprise you. We need to open up the bottom part of that iceberg to the players. making them feel that the map is shifting, changing, and evolving. It needs to feel dynamic with player choice and agency across many different plays of that same map, with the player never quite knowing how it's all going to unfold. So, how could Iceberg maps work? The bottom part of the Iceberg would hold all of those random elements that can trigger off-screen. Doors, buttons, events, special bosses, pathways, locations, and so on. Starting off simple with these examples, we could literally just have something that is on or off. A route you took last time using an elevator, perhaps it's now broken on this run, so you would have to find an alternate route. Adding a bit more complexity, we could have these moving elements on random timers. Perhaps the elevator would choose, say, a time between 6 minutes and 11 minutes where it will change from on to off, or potentially vice versa, opening up entirely different paths and even objectives. Even with something as basic as this, we are adding variation to the static map. Players start to feel the weight of their actions. If they take too long to maybe loot one area, it might make it so they have a harder route later on. We can take this further by having entirely scripted events that work to these random timings. The events could also overlap, perhaps impacting each other and the different routes or even success chances to complete other events later on. Let's go back to the Darktide map we looked at earlier and focus in on this bridge fight for some event examples. What if there was a fuel pumping room en route to this bridge? Depending how quickly we get to that room, there might be lots of fuel or no fuel left at all. We could then redirect this to the bridge. Now when you get to the bridge fight, you have the option to use that fuel to ignite bridge sections, making it so that you can have choke points to help you fight the horde. The bridge could be designed so that it was larger and more complicated, making this event a mini tower defense game for the players. This could also overlap with another event. Maybe there's a lift near or attached to the bridge that has the option to be refueled. The player can choose to use that fuel to ignite the bridge or the lift, and then that lift could take them to a different route or open up a new area of the map. And that different path taken using the fueled elevator could have its own events that can impact the map later on, perhaps even helping or hindering the final objective. The more elements like this in the map, the greater amount of pathways the player has to a different experience each time. And we're not just talking about an arbitrary choice like going left or right, but real player choice and empowerment to try and control the map or deal with the randomness that it throws at them. The Iceberg style of map is going to provide that familiar feeling after a few plays, yet you're never going to quite know how it's all going to unfold on this run. And hopefully some amazing player experiences with stories to be remembered and told to other players. This all sounds absolutely awesome to me and a type of map that I'd want to come back to over and over again. These Iceberg style of maps are most definitely going to be an extra burden on the developer. They need to have the vision to be able to create this dynamic map with many different paths and events that can be interconnected yet still work no matter if they're closed, open, or how long the players take to get there. The Iceberg map is definitely going to take longer to design, more resources to create, it's going to be an absolute pain to play test, and it's probably going to have many bugs which need to be fixed along the way. You are also likely going to have systems in place to make it so players don't argue about what route they want to take or events that they want to do or skip in this particular run. But if the extra effort expands how many runs the player will be in this sweet spot for, effectively making them engage or have fun with the game longer, it's a win-win for everyone involved and seems to be worth the investment, in my mind at least. Let me know in the comments what games and maps keep you coming back, as I may do a follow-up to this video and I've only just looked at these 2 games today. A like on this video really helps me out and shows me that I'm doing something right with them, and thank you so much for watching.